I think people aren't aware of how much single-use or disposable cardboard, plastic they produce or use because they only have it for a moment and then it gets thrown away. It's when you see it all gathered together and made permanent in the form of a bench, in the form of something solid and concrete, that you might start to realise actually that's quite a lot of stuff.
Earlier this year, the LFA launched the 4th edition of the City Ventures competition, a design competition in collaboration with Cheapside Business Alliance and Aldgate Connect Bid. The competition looked to transform Cheapside and Aldgate streetscape with imaginative and witty takes on much needed public seating. We caught up with each of the winning designers to find out the story behind the benches. Here, Nick tells us about his bench, Do You Care About Your City?
My name's Nick Green, I'm an Edinburgh-based architect, and my bench is called Do You Care About Your City? Thinking about the festival's theme of care, I started trying to imagine how that could relate to the urban realm in a kind of pragmatic sense. It's not the immediately obvious interpretation of caring, but the idea of care kind of came to me as thinking about whether we care or not. I guess a very literal kind of representation is the presence of litter or rubbish around us. The design of the bench is based on this idea that litter, although a kind of transient, is actually quite permanent in its impact. And so I wanted to use that litter and kind of see if it could be used to create a kind of terrazzo, so a material that's usually associated with grandeur, with permanence, and so kind of flipping the litter that we normally see on its head into something solid, grand, almost impressive, to make people aware of the impact that it has. Building on the idea of litter as a permanent thing, I was thinking about a range of different materials. You come across plastics, for example, that use recycled yogurt pots and coffee cup lids and things, and you see the flecks of the colours and patterns in the materials. So I explored the route of using plastic to produce the bench, but at the same time I kept going back to this idea of something solid and kind of with physical weight and presence, and that led me down the route of exploring concrete, which is the kind of traditional original route of terrazzo, of which itself comes from waste tiles being reused in cement. So there's kind of a tie back to the first terrazzos being litter in a way. And I started talking to the firm Smith and Goat, who are a London-based concrete manufacturer, and they explore different ways of using concrete. And so working with them on a bit of back and forth of developing a design, we've kind of arrived at the final bench, which is mostly concrete with litter fragments embedded in it with a resin layer on top. And we think that kind of combines the practicalities needed to make the bench with a sense of permanence, grandeur, and also with the resin itself, it adds a bit of a sheen, kind of aligning it to more classical terrazzos and marbles and things like that. So working with Smith and Goat, we've kind of gone through a process of kind of material development where we've tested out which fragments of litter work best and how to integrate them within the concrete, exploring different textures and things like that. And at the same time, we've been thinking about the form of the bench. My initial concept was that the bench would have a relatively simple form, but one that kind of references the forms and architecture of the buildings surrounding us in the City of London. So ranging from things like St. Paul's Cathedral down to the podiums of statues, where there's quite simple, solid kind of cuboid forms, but with little flares. And you see that in the final bench design. So it's a combination of the form and the material that creates this impression of permanence. Although I'm based in Edinburgh, I was really keen that the bench responded to its context being in London, but also specifically being in the City of London. It's a place of, at least pre-pandemic times, a place where people would go to offices and there would be a culture of kind of take-out lunches. And that's fed into the choices of litter, for example. I wanted the litter to be city-specific in a way. So there's a lot of coffee cups and train tickets and things like that, and the kind of things that you might just casually leave on a bench if you're in a rush to get back to your office. As an architect, I'm obviously less used to kind of designing kind of furniture and smaller products, but in our kind of working lives, we're constantly thinking about materials. And that's played into the development of the bench in really interesting ways, about getting to work directly with makers, getting to really focus on the material itself. In a way, the kind of form of the bench, for me at least, is secondary. And it's been great to work with Smith & Goat on developing the material and have that kind of back and forth to really get to what we want it to achieve in the end. The aim is to have a gradual impact with the bench. It's not an immediate bolshy statement that it makes. It's a relatively modest form, but when you get up close to it, you might start to realize what it's made of. I think people aren't aware of how much single-use or disposable cardboard, plastic they produce or use, because they only have it for a moment and then it gets thrown away. It's when you see it all gathered together and made permanent in the form of a bench, in the form of something solid and concrete, that you might start to realise, actually, that's quite a lot of stuff.
You've been listening to Building Sounds. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more of our recent conversation, search for Building Sounds on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favourite podcast.